The most famous beach in America is not natural. The sand under all those postcards was dredged off the bottom of Biscayne Bay and pumped onto a mangrove swamp so thick with mosquitoes that the men clearing it wore netting over their faces. A car salesman from Indiana named Carl Fisher looked at that swamp in 1913 and decided it would become a playground for the rich. He turned out to be right, though he died broke before he could enjoy being right. What he built went on to reinvent itself more times than almost any place in the country. It was a whites-only resort that banned Jews, then a refuge for Holocaust survivors. It became a retirement porch for the elderly, then the murder capital backdrop of the cocaine era, then the set of the coolest show on television, then the address where supermodels and a soon-to-be murdered fashion designer made it the center of the world. Every version collapsed and got rebuilt. Now the wheel has turned again, and the city that once spent a fortune begging America to visit is spending a fortune begging one particular crowd to stay home. How a strip of dredged sand became the most reinvented square mile in America, and why its own government now runs ads telling tourists to go elsewhere, starts with a bet nobody sane would have made. The land began as a sandbar choked with mangroves, a humid tangle of roots and mud sitting across the water from the small town of Miami. A New Jersey Quaker named John Collins had tried to farm it, planting avocados and coconuts, and he was going broke doing it. He needed a bridge to haul his crops to the mainland, and he had run out of money to finish one. That was when Carl Fisher showed up. Fisher had already made a fortune in Indiana on carbide headlights and had helped lay out the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, and he was one of the loudest boosters of the new automobile highways then being cut across the country. He loaned Collins the cash to complete what became the longest wooden bridge in the world, and in exchange, he took a large stretch of the island for himself. Then he did the thing that changed everything. He hired crews to tear out the mangroves, and he dredged the floor of Biscayne Bay, pumping the muck up onto the swamp until he had dry, solid ground where there had been water and roots. The white sand that tourists would one day lie on was manufactured, hauled up from the bottom of a bay. Fisher looked at his new island and saw a resort for the wealthy, and in 1915 he and Collins and a pair of brothers named Lummis incorporated the town of Miami Beach. By 1918, a causeway tied the island permanently to the mainland, and the place that had existed mostly on paper began to fill in for real. Selling a swamp to America took nerve and noise, and Fisher had a surplus of both. He hired a publicist named Steve Hannigan, plastered the northern cities with images of bathing beauties on sun-drenched sand, and in 1920, he bought a giant illuminated sign in Times Square that read, "It's June in Miami." The pitch landed. Middle-class families packed into Model T Fords, drove south on the new roads, and chased warm winters and cheap lots, and Miami Beach detonated into one of the wildest real estate booms the country had ever seen. Fisher built polo fields and golf courses and grand hotels like the Flamingo and the Nautilus, added the Roman pools and a casino, and dredged whole new islands out of the bay to sell those too. In 1923 alone, he moved $6 million worth of lots, much of it land that had been underwater a few seasons earlier. By 1925, at the peak of the frenzy, his Miami Beach holdings were valued at around $40 million. The resident population exploded, growing more than 400% in a handful of years. A small army of quick-buck traders known as binder boys worked the sidewalks, buying and flipping the paper deposits on lots, sometimes reselling the same one several times in a single afternoon before the deed ever changed hands. A city that had started as a car salesman's hunch was suddenly the hottest address in America. Almost nobody stopped to ask what would happen if the weather or the money turned. The weather turned first. In September 1926, a massive hurricane came ashore directly over Miami Beach, flooding the island, stripping the roofs off Fisher's hotels, and killing hundreds of people across South Florida. The land boom, already wobbling under its own speculation, collapsed within months. Then the Great Depression arrived and finished the job. And Carl Fisher, the man who had conjured a city out of mud, lost nearly all of it. He died in 1939, largely forgotten and close to broke, in the resort he had invented. What he left behind carried an ugly rule written straight into its property deeds. Fisher and the other early developers used restrictive covenants to bar the sale of most of Miami Beach to Jewish buyers, who were penned into the blocks south of 5th Street. Signs in hotel windows read, "Gentiles only," and one oceanfront hotel ran an advertisement with the line, "Always a view, never a Jew." Black Americans were kept off the beach after dark entirely, and black workers reportedly had to carry identification cards just to be there during the day. The playground Fisher built for the wealthy had walls that most visitors never saw, and those walls would take decades to fall. Miami Beach did not even pass a law banning the Gentiles only signs until 1947, and the resentment underneath the sunshine would outlast the signs by a long stretch. A bust could not keep Miami Beach still for long. All through the 1930s, while the rest of the country crawled through the Depression, developers on the southern end of the island threw up hundreds of small hotels and apartment houses in the streamlined geometric style of the moment. Architects like Henry Hohauser and L. Murray Dixon gave them curved corners, porthole windows, racing stripes, glass block, and neon, a tropical spin on the Art Deco fashion sweeping the world's fairs. The buildings were cheap to put up and modern to look at, wrapped in pastel, and named to promise glamour on a working man's budget. Nobody at the time thought of them as important. They were low-rise, low-cost resort buildings meant to fill fast and turn a quick profit. And they were designed to catch the eye of a family stepping off a train, not to last for the ages. Yet they went up in such density, block after block of the same optimistic design, that South Beach accidentally became home to the largest concentration of Art Deco architecture anywhere on Earth. That fact would sit ignored for 40 years, until the buildings were rotting, and a fight over whether to save them or bulldoze them would decide the whole neighborhood's fate. For the moment, they were simply where the tourists slept, and for a while, there were plenty of tourists to fill them. World War II turned the beach into a barracks. After Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Corps commandeered hundreds of Miami Beach hotels, marching recruits down Ocean Drive and drilling them on the same sand where sunbathers had lounged a year earlier. Tens of thousands of soldiers trained there, and when the war ended, a good number of them remembered the place and came back with wives and children. The post-war money pushed the action north, up Collins Avenue, where developers went hunting for a richer and flashier crowd than the aging South End could hold. The building that defined the new era opened in 1954. A hotelier named Ben Novak tore down a tire magnate's beachfront mansion and hired the architect Morris Lapidus to build the most extravagant resort in the country, the Fontainebleau, a sweeping crescent of a hotel with a 17,000 square foot lobby, 554 rooms, an ice skating rink, a pool shaped like a cat, and a grand marble staircase that led on purpose to nowhere. Its only job was to let guests come down it and be seen. Lapidus said flatly that he wanted people to walk in and drop dead. The opening dinner served 110 pounds of caviar to 1,600 guests. Liberace played the piano, and Groucho Marx pronounced the place the eighth wonder of the world. For a decade, this was the glamour capital of the United States. Frank Sinatra and Dean Martin and the rest of the Rat Pack floated between the Fontainebleau and the Eden Rock that Lapidus built right next door. And Sinatra shot a movie inside the Fontainebleau while the James Bond picture Goldfinger opened on its pool deck. When Jackie Gleason moved his television variety show to Miami Beach in 1964, he beamed it to the whole country every week as coming to you from the sun and fun capital of the world. The hotels ran midnight buffets and cabaret reviews, and the beach glittered with a confidence that seemed like it could never run out. But the same forces that had built the boom were steadily dismantling it. Cheap jet travel meant a family could now fly to the Bahamas or the Caribbean for what it cost to drive to Florida. Disney World opened near Orlando in 1971 and pulled the family trade inland. Home air conditioning made the entire state livable year-round, which erased Miami Beach's special claim on the warm winter. The gleaming high-rises up north drank up the luxury money, and the small Art Deco hotels on the south end, now aging and unfashionable, were left to whoever would still rent them by the month. That turned out to be the old. By the late 1960s, South Beach had become one of the largest retirement communities in the United States, and almost no one had planned it that way. Elderly Jews from New York and the other northern cities discovered that the faded Art Deco hotels rented rooms monthly for almost nothing, in a warm climate, a short walk from the ocean, and they poured in by the thousands. By the 1970s, the roughly 2-square-mile district held around 20,000 Jewish residents, close to 80% of the population, and a large share of them were Holocaust survivors who had crossed an ocean to end up rocking on these porches. Yiddish theater, dying out everywhere else in the country, thrived here, and South Beach supported 6 Yiddish playhouses. Kosher butchers and small synagogues filled the side streets. Old men gathered to pray in makeshift temples inside the lobbies of hotels that a generation earlier had advertised themselves as closed to their kind. Squeezed by fixed incomes and rising prices, one longtime resident told a city official that another jump in the rent and she would be down to cheese and crackers. The neighborhood earned a nickname that carried both affection and cruelty in equal measure. People called it God's Waiting Room. It was a real and warm community, and it spent almost nothing. And to the developers watching the buildings decay, it looked like a problem waiting for a solution. Then the bottom dropped out completely. In 1980, Fidel Castro opened the Cuban port of Mariel, and roughly 125,000 people crossed to South Florida in a matter of months, a wave that swamped the region and, fairly or not, got blamed for much of the disorder that followed. In the same stretch of years, cocaine turned Miami into a battlefield. Colombian traffickers ran the drug through South Florida by the ton, and by some estimates, the trade was worth more to the local economy than tourism and real estate combined. The money came with bodies, and by 1981, Miami was the murder capital of America, splashed across a Time magazine cover under the words, "Paradise Lost." South Beach sat at the frayed edge of all of it. The grand old hotels stood half empty, their neon dead, their rooms let to the poor and the elderly, and more to addicts squatting in the abandoned ones. Dealers worked corners where fashion models would later pose. Residents bolted their doors after dark and traded stories about muggings and break-ins. Lincoln Road, once a shopping street to rival any in the South, emptied out except for a Woolworth's and a few artists working in the vacant storefronts. Parking was never a problem because hardly anyone came. A man who moved there in 1985 said the place looked like the end of the world, full of crack addicts sleeping in the shelves of buildings nobody wanted. Part of what pulled South Beach back was a community that much of the country was busy shunning. Through the 1980s and into the 1990s, gay men moved into the cheap, crumbling district in large numbers, opening cafes, guest houses, and clubs, restoring rooms nobody else would touch, and building a nightlife that gave the neighborhood a pulse again. Much of the early energy behind saving the old architecture came from that community and from the elderly residents living inside the buildings, an unlikely pairing that funded and fought for preservation while the money men were still sizing up the wrecking ball. The revival carried its own grief. The AIDS epidemic tore through South Beach as it rose, killing many of the same people whose work was bringing it back to life, including the designer whose color choices would come to define the entire district. The place was reviving and mourning at the same time, on the same pastel blocks, and both things were true at once. It gave the rebirth a bittersweet undertone that the tourist brochures would never mention, and it meant that something was being lost even in the years when everything seemed to be found. The rescue of the buildings themselves came from an unlikely person. Barbara Kapitman was a widowed writer from New York who had moved to Miami Beach in the early 1970s and fallen for the crumbling Art Deco hotels that everyone else dismissed as junk. In 1976, she founded the Miami Design Preservation League with a designer named Leonard Horowitz, and she launched a crusade to get the whole district protected before the bulldozers could finish it off. It was an uphill fight from the start. Developers wanted the low-rise hotels gone so they could put up towers, and city officials mostly sided with them. Kapitman marched, lobbied, held candlelight vigils, and on more than one occasion planted herself directly in front of a bulldozer to stop a demolition. In May 1979, she won the thing that mattered most, when the district became the first 20th century neighborhood in the nation ever placed on the National Register of Historic Places. Horowitz repainted the drab hotels in the palette of pinks, purples, and mint greens that would become the signature look of the beach. She did not save everything. The elegant Senator Hotel was torn down for a parking garage in 1988, one of the losses that haunted her. Her own bluntness eventually got her pushed out of the very group she had built. But more than 800 Art Deco buildings survived because she refused to move. And both she and Horowitz were gone by 1990 before they could see how completely they had won. What Kapitman saved needed a spark, and television delivered it. In 1984, a stylish police drama called Miami Vice went on the air, and its detectives chased traffickers in pastel suits down an ocean drive lit like a neon fever dream. The show ran until 1989, and it sold the world a new picture of the beach, dangerous and beautiful at once. At the exact moment the restoration was taking hold, the movie Scarface had already planted the same violent glamour in theaters a year earlier. Fashion photographers noticed the light, the color, and the almost free rents, and they began flying down to shoot against the freshly painted hotels. Supermodels followed the cameras. A spot called the News Cafe opened on Ocean Drive in 1988 and turned into a round-the-clock hangout for the new crowd of photographers, club owners, and New York transplants who could smell what was coming. One of them said living there felt like living in Casablanca, exciting and a little lawless, a place outsiders thought was too dangerous to visit. Nightclubs opened in buildings that had been flop houses a few years earlier. The old residents who had defined the place for a generation were dying off or getting priced out, and their calm, kosher, Yiddish-speaking South Beach gave way to something loud, gorgeous, and expensive. In under a decade, the neighborhood had gone from the murder capital's forgotten corner to the coolest address on the planet. No one embodied the new South Beach more than Gianni Versace. The Italian designer arrived in 1991, bought and lavishly restored a mansion called Casa Casuarina on Ocean Drive, and pulled a permanent orbit of celebrities and fashion royalty to his front gate. His presence certified the beach as the center of global glamour, the place where the beautiful people came to be seen. Then, on the morning of July 15, 1997, Versace walked home from the News Cafe, where he had gone for magazines and coffee, climbed the steps of his own front gate, and was shot twice in the head by a spree killer named Andrew Cunanan. He died there on the marble steps in broad daylight, a short distance from a police substation. Versace was the last of 5 people Cunanan murdered across the country that spring, and the hunt for him had already grown into one of the largest manhunts in America. The killer slipped away into the crowd, hid on a houseboat in the bay, and shot himself 8 days later as police finally closed in. The murder stunned the world and drew every camera in America to Ocean Drive. It also marked a turn. People who were there say the celebrities grew wary afterward, that some of the innocents drained out of the scene even as the tourists kept arriving. South Beach had reached its glittering summit, and the summit had a body lying on its front steps. The party did not stop after that. It professionalized. All through the 2000s, South Beach ran on nightclubs, celebrity restaurants, condo towers, and music videos, a non-stop high-season churn of money and image. Developers who had once itched to flatten the Art Deco hotels now poured fortunes into restoring them, because the pastel buildings Barbara Capitman had chained herself to protect had become the single most valuable stretch of beachfront in the South. Robert De Niro co-founded a restaurant there. Gloria Estefan opened one on the sand. Models, athletes, and rappers made the beach a fixture of magazine covers and music videos. And reality shows used its clubs and pool decks as free scenery. The neighborhood that had once been too poor to bother with was now too expensive for many of the people who had rebuilt it, and its own fame was starting to work against it, pulling in bigger and rowdier crowds than the narrow strip of Ocean Drive was ever built to hold. But a resort built on the promise of an endless party draws the party in every one of its forms. And by the 2000s, spring break had swollen into something the city could no longer control. Every March, enormous crowds descended on Ocean Drive, drawn by cheap flights, warm sand, and a reputation for anything goes. During the pandemic years, the crowds grew even larger as students fled locked-down states for a Florida that stayed open for business. The gatherings turned dense, then unruly, then plainly dangerous, and the trouble landed on the same blocks where Versace had died and where the neon still promised a good time. The breaking point came in 2023. 2 people were shot dead during spring break. Crowds stampeded down Ocean Drive, and the city declared a state of emergency and slapped on an overnight curfew. Police made nearly 500 arrests that season and seized more than 100 firearms. City leaders decided they had reached the end of their patience. Ahead of 2024, Miami Beach launched a campaign it openly called Breaking Up with Spring Break, releasing a slick video that addressed the party crowd like a jilted lover and announced the relationship was over. The rules that came with it were built to make the trip miserable for anyone showing up to misbehave. Midnight curfews, DUI checkpoints, bag searches, $100 to park, and tow fees running several hundred more for out-of-town cars. Governor Ron DeSantis sent state troopers to back the city up, and the following year, the city ran the playbook again with a second viral video daring the crowds to test it. The crackdown worked on its own terms. Arrests fell, the shootings stopped, and the mayor bragged about a spring break with no deaths and no stampedes. Tourists that March described Ocean Drive with a single flat word: dead. The most famous party street in America had been switched off on purpose by the very people who ran it. The street itself had already become a battleground before the breakup campaign began. During the pandemic in 2020, the city closed the stretch of Ocean Drive to cars, handing the roadway over to walkers and outdoor diners. And what started as a public health measure hardened into a years-long argument about what the street was even for. Hotel owners sued, complaining that guests could no longer reach their doors and that business was bleeding out. Some residents loved the open promenade and the chance to actually see the Art Deco facades without a wall of traffic in front of them. Others wanted the cars back and the old rhythm restored. The city eventually reopened part of the road in 2022, replacing parking with bike lanes, pleasing almost nobody completely. The fight looked small next to shootings and curfews, but it captured something about the whole neighborhood, a place so contested that it could not agree on whether cars belonged on its signature street. Every square foot of South Beach carries an argument about who it is really for, and Ocean Drive, the most photographed road in Florida, could not settle even that. The crackdown also drew a sharper criticism that the city has never fully shaken. In recent years, the spring break crowd on South Beach has been heavily black, and civil rights advocates argued that the curfews, the checkpoints, and the towing fees were aimed less at violence than at scaring away black visitors in particular. City officials answered that the measures applied to everyone and that the only goal was to stop people from being killed on Ocean Drive. By 2026, the enforcement leaned on cameras, drones, and a real-time crime center trained on the crowds, the kind of surveillance that left critics uneasy about exactly who all that technology was watching. Both things sat uneasily side by side, a real safety problem and a real question about who exactly was being told to stay home on a beach whose deeds had once literally barred Jews and pushed black workers off the sand after dark. The history of who gets to enjoy this square mile and who gets moved along runs a great deal deeper than one rowdy month in March. It was there in the covenants of the 1920s, and it was there again in the license plate readers of the 2020s. The faces changed and the language softened, but the underlying argument about who belongs on the most valuable sand in the South never quite went away. Turning off the party turned off a great deal of the money along with it. Business owners on Ocean Drive, who count on the March crowds to carry them through the slow months, watched their revenue crater. The owner of Mangoes, a club that had anchored the Strip for 3 decades, said his income and everyone else's had fallen by around 30%, and he flatly called it a bloodbath. The owner of another well-known bar reported the same 30% drop and pointed the finger straight at the city's own marketing videos. Others blamed the curfews and the parking fees, and above all, that advertising, which had spent real money telling people to stay away and had succeeded a little too well. The trouble ran deeper than spring break, too. By 2025, much of Florida's coast was reporting a strange slump. Record visitor numbers on paper, but empty beach chairs and short bar tabs in practice, as Canadian snowbirds stopped coming and travelers grew sick of paying resort fees and $30 parking on top of hotel rooms that now averaged well over $200 a night and only kept climbing. South Beach, costly even by Florida standards, felt it hard. City Hall pushed back that resort tax collections were still running well above where they had stood before the pandemic, and that protecting the global brand mattered more than any single soft season. But the owners, staring at empty marches, took little comfort in the long view. Resort tax revenue, one rough gauge of the cash moving through the city, had already slipped from its post-pandemic peak, and the quiet season losses only widened the gap. The city had spent a full century solving one crisis after another: the swamp, the hurricane, the decay, the drugs, the violence, only to walk straight into a new one it had built for itself. It had finally made the beach safe, and in the process, it had left a lot of people wondering why they were bothering to come at all. By early 2026, even the city seemed to blink. After 3 straight springs of containing the chaos, and after business owners begged for something closer to normal, Miami Beach voted to loosen some of the very rules it had leaned on, pledging to pull down most of the traffic barricades, reopen the parking garages and sidewalk cafes, and stretch the beach hours back out. The rules that had bought the calm had also choked the commerce, with towing fees north of $500 for out-of-town cars, sealed garages, and fenced-off blocks that told casual visitors to look somewhere else. The safety numbers that spring were the best yet, with arrests down again and emergency calls in the entertainment district falling by roughly 2/3. And the head of the Ocean Drive Business Association said plainly that there was no going back, only forward. But the damage to the storefronts had already been done. Miami Beach had drifted into one of the highest retail vacancy rates in the region, with more square footage emptied out than leased across 2025, and prime spaces on Ocean Drive sat unrented for months, while brokers struggled to pitch a district whose identity had become hard to define. One agent spent the better part of a year trying to lease a single storefront on the Strip and watched one restaurant concept after another walk away. One of them admitted the city may have pushed so far that it signaled to the world it was closed for business. The violence had been driven off and the party had been tamed, and the question left hanging over the neon was whether anyone still knew what South Beach was supposed to be, or who it was supposed to be for. Step back far enough and a pattern shows through the whole story. This square mile of manufactured sand has never once held still. It was a swamp, then a boom town, then a bust, then a barracks, then the most glamorous resort in the country, then a warehouse for the forgotten old, then a war zone, then a ruin somebody fought to save, then the coolest place on earth. Every version was announced as permanent, and every version fell, and something no one predicted grew up in the wreckage. The thing that keeps wrecking South Beach is the same thing that keeps rescuing it, because the place is too warm, too valuable, and too useful to be left alone. So each generation remakes it into whatever the moment happens to want. Even now, the city is loosening its grip, inching back toward the crowds it spent 3 years shoving away, because a beach lined with empty storefronts scares it more than a loud one ever did. The headlines now say nobody wants to visit anymore, and for this turn of the wheel on these particular blocks, that is partly true. But the beach was built on a bet that people would always chase the sun, and that bet has paid out over and over for more than 100 years. Each crowd that made the place famous eventually wore out its welcome and moved on, and each time the sand sat empty for a spell before the next crowd showed up to claim it. The sand is artificial, the wanting is not. Whatever South Beach becomes next, it has already survived worse than a slow spring, and it has never once stayed down for long. Hey, thank you so much for watching this whole thing all the way through. It really does mean a lot to me. If you're up for another one, I've got a video right there on the screen that I think you'll really enjoy. And I'm slowly trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, which is the point where I actually start seeing any ad money at all. So, if you had a good time hanging out with me, I'd love to have you stick around.